Let's say if you go after the person that you're arguing with and you say, you're a bad person, and you really make that case, you bloody well hammer it home, you remember 50 things they've done that were bad and you lay them out. It's like, I'm going to stomp you, you're a bad person, you really need to change. Okay, well, first of all, you're going to meet tremendous resistance, and that's like you've got the hydrogen, you're bringing the hydrogen bomb to the war, right? And maybe, unless you want to destroy everything, maybe that's not the most logical solution. But then by the same token, everything's all right and we never have any conflict. That's not helpful either, and you're going to get bored of that and you're not going to develop. And so then the question is, well, maybe there's some happy medium here. Maybe you want to be repairing this structure, you know, the structure that goes from micro actions up to higher order conceptualizations. Maybe you want to be updating that on a constant basis. And you want to update it in a manner that doesn't drop you into chaos or place you in too much stasis. And then the answer is, well, how? Then the question is, how is it that you can calibrate your approach to error so that you get the benefits of doing it without the disadvantage of collapsing into chaos? And then the answer to that is something like, it's something like, once you have decided to adopt responsibility for being, and we'll say that what that means is that you have conceptualized a good that you're willing to devote yourself to, and I think you're perfectly welcome to do that on an individual basis. I think you should do it on an individual basis. You should consult with your ancestors while you're doing that, because generally speaking, the route to optimal, the route to quality of life and productivity has been laid out by other people. We kind of know what the parameters are. You need to do something that other people find is useful. And you have to regard it as useful as well. Or at least you have to be entertaining. There has to be something about you of value to other people that you have to pursue with a fair bit of diligence. So you have to play a productive social role. Probably need friends. Probably need an intimate relationship. And if it could be medium to long-term intimate relationship, perhaps all the better. That's what most societies hold up as ideal. Could assume, well, there's probably a reason for that. I think one of the reasons is that your life gets fragmented otherwise, badly fragmented, you know, because every time you have a long-term relationship and it fragments, it's like your identity is blown into pieces. You get fragmented across time. It's not good. It breaks you into pieces, and you don't necessarily recover that well. It makes everything much more impermanent and unreliable, all of those things. So it introduces a tremendous amount of uncertainty into your life, and it also means that you don't have anyone around that you can really trust, and that's bad. Because if you have someone around you can really trust, then you have two brains instead of one, and like you probably need two brains to manage your way through life. It's pretty complicated. So you orient yourself towards some good, the highest good that you can conceptualize, and it has to be through a consultation with your ancestors, because you need to do the things that people have always done, and you need to do them properly, and you need to assume that that's the way that you should live, unless you have a very good reason to change it dramatically, and maybe you do, but you got to start with some axiomatic set of presuppositions, because otherwise you have to invent everything on your own, and you don't have enough time to do that. So you have to use normative guidelines. And if you don't, then people won't know what to do with you. That's another big problem. If you live completely outside the norm. I mean, you know, remarkable artists manage that to some degree. But of course, they pay for the privilege by being remarkable artists. So if there's something truly remarkable about you, perhaps you could justify deviating from the normative path. But if there isn't, first of all, there's nothing remarkable enough about you to justify deviating in every way from the normative path, no matter how remarkable you are. So that's part of the rescuing of the father from the depths, is to reunite yourself with the traditional structures of your community. You can do that in a way that you feel suits your own needs best. But I don't think you can not do it, because it makes you weak. And then you'll drown. All right, so let's say you have oriented yourself, but not perfectly, because you're full of mistakes and errors. So then what do you do? Because you have to fix those errors, but you still have to be oriented. And this is why I started to get interested in the phenomena of meaning as a phenomenological experience, to experience something as meaningful. It's not exactly obvious what that means, to experience something as meaningful. I think that you can approach it obliquely, you know, like if I said, watch yourself for 2 weeks and notice when you're doing something that you regard as meaningful. I could say, well, here's some markers. You lose a sense of time, you lose a sense of vulnerability, you're deeply engaged in it. It seems worth the effort, right? You forget yourself while you're doing it. Maybe you forget your existential concerns while you're doing it. You're not ruminating or obsessing about the meaning of your life, right? So there's markers for it. It's like the flow states that Csikszentmihalyi described. And then you can experience it under certain sort of ritualistic conditions. You might experience it when you go see a great movie. You might experience it when you listen to music. I think music is a very, very standard pathway for people to have that kind of experience, because virtually everyone gets intimations of meaning from music. And I think music is hierarchically structured patterns that are representative of being laying itself out properly. It's something like that. So it's an abstract representation of proper being. And so we can grapple with the phenomena of music, and we can box, or phenomena of meaning, we can box it in a little bit and start to conceptualize it. We can start to conceptualize it perhaps as the manifestation of a deep instinct. And so I would say, well, meaning is what manifests itself when you've oriented yourself properly, and when you've optimized the flow of information between you and chaos. That might be the right way of thinking about it. Because you think about a piece of music, is you want it to be predictable, but you don't want it to be perfectly predictable. You want it to be predictable with some interesting variations, and predictable with some variations that make sense. And maybe you can conceptualize that as something like this. It's like, it's predictable at this order of stability, but it's varying down here from time to time. And so you've got stability there, but variability there, and you can handle that. So you want an overarching structure of stability with some internal variability. And maybe that's the way that you update yourself without falling apart. And then I would say you can find the pathway to the optimal rate of update by relying on your sense of meaning. That's what it's for. What it tells you is that you're wandering your way through the world between the catastrophes of chaos and the catastrophes of order, and now and then you swing into the proper locale. You're where you should be. And what happens is you get engaged by that. You get meaningfully engaged by that. And it's fragile. It'll move on you, right? Because it's very difficult to exist at that point constantly. Your bad habits, all sorts of things, your situation, there's all sorts of things that are going to interfere with that. But that doesn't mean that that isn't where you should be. And so then you might say, well, that's where you should strive to be all the time. And then the question might be, well, what would it be like if you were there all the time? And I think that's where intimations of paradise come from. I mean, when I think it was Wordsworth talked about intimations of immortality in childhood, people tend to romanticize their childhood because of the sense of intense engagement that goes along with being a child. And it's one of the wonderful things about being around children, actually. They pay you for their care. And the way that children pay you for their care is that they turn normal things into magic again when you're around them, because you've seen it 100 times before. And so when you see it, you don't see it. You see what you already know. But when a child sees it, they don't, because they don't know. They see it, and then when you watch them see it, you see it too. And so it's tremendous fun leading a small child around to do things that you've done before, because they're so, they're like this. They're like all the time, and maybe that's too much, and they cry and they get upset and all of that, but a good part of the time it's just wild-eyed wonder, and then you can see the world through their eyes, and it's payment. And so that sense of being engaged like that is something that people love about children, and rightly so. But it's also a marker to the proper way of being. There's a dictum in this is a Jungian idea, that there's no difference between the archetype of the wise old man and the archetype of the child. They're the same thing. because the wise old man is the person who found what he had in childhood but lost. Right, that's a very powerful motif, is that the purpose of maturation is to return to the state of childhood as a mature being, not to stay in the state of childhood. That's Peter Pan. But to make the sacrifices necessary for maturation and then return. So, well, how do you do that? Well, you do that in part by noting what it is that's meaningful for you to engage in. I would say it's your nervous system reporting to you, right hemisphere and left hemisphere balanced. The balance between chaos and order produces an output that says you are in the right place. It's a perception. The meaning is a perception of being in the right place. It's the genuine thing. However, because it can be pathologized, that's the thing, and that's why I think there's a call to virtue in most great religious traditions. If you're going to rely on your sense of meaning to orient you, you have to play a straight game, because otherwise you warp and twist the inputs, and then the mechanism won't function properly. You know, it's like if you've blinded yourself to half the world, you can't use your perceptions to orient yourself properly, because the half of the world that you're ignoring is going to pop up at you unexpectedly and take you down. And so if your relationship with the world isn't pristine, honest primarily, then you can't rely on your own internal orienting mechanisms. And then you either fall into chaos, which is an absolute catastrophe, or you have to rely on some kind of external authority. And that makes you prone to possession by tyrannical ideologies, for example, which give you that sense of meaning that you should in fact have as a consequence of your own action.
So, sorry, bear with me because I'm going to try to word this question as best as I can. But, okay, so if all relationships are sort of predicated on this balance between no conflict and conflict that destructs, then if we were to look at this at a more macro level, we see this sort of manifest in history in our world, like with conflict in between countries, in between systems, ideology, etc. But wouldn't this sort of navigation between the exact line of no conflict versus conflict, how does that not imply that some people are inherently doomed to chaos?
It might imply that. You know, one of the things, so look, sometimes you don't have an answer that works. You have an answer that produces the highest probability of success. And like, I could view the archetypal world from a religious perspective and say that there's such a thing as ultimate and final redemption. That's a metaphysical claim. I don't want to do that. I think it's independent of what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that there's an archetypal path that's laid out in the mythology of the hero, and it's your best bet. That's all. It's your best bet. It doesn't mean that if you apply it, that everything is going to turn out the way you might want it to turn out. But I would say this, there's a way there's an interesting twist on that too. This is one of the things that I came to understand about trying to speak the truth, is that you can make an assumption, you can make a fundamental assumption based on your ignorance, let's say, and the ineradicable quality of your ignorance, that you can't compute the best possible outcome. What you can do instead is make a decision, and one decision is, well, I'm going to say what I think and see what happens. And then you can define that as the best possible outcome. Now you might say, well, now and then that's going to lead you into chaos. It's like, yeah, it is. It is. It's a strange inversion. But regardless of all that, I would still say human beings are finite and limited and mortal, you know, and death is final, let's say. I'm not saying that, but we could easily say that. Doesn't matter. This is still the best pathway forward. It isn't certainty. There's no certainty. And it's very frequently in life you have poison A or poison B. Like, you get to pick your poison. You don't get to pick the elixir of life. But I would also say I don't think there's any reason to be particularly pessimistic, because we don't know what would happen if people really tried hard to get their acts together. Like, if they understood the necessity of that and really put it forward. I mean, I've had lots of experience with my clinical clients now. You know, I've seen dozens and dozens of people, and we have tried jointly to get their lives straighter, and it works almost inevitably.